Welcome. My talk today is going to cover the results of a study that I completed at the request of your Department of Communication, and completed that about a year ago. And really, since it was done for the Communication Department, I've really taken a communication perspective with it. And we'll present, I used qualitative analysis and methodology that's pretty common among communication studies. And my findings do carry my bias a bit as a communication scholar and somebody who's worked in technical communication for a long time. Just over a year ago, the department was presented with the opportunity to directly contribute to the work of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, known as RACI. And it's a partnership that was formed several years back between CU Boulder and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So it's a research partnership. It has a staff of maybe 10 or 11, I think, and maybe 35 maybe fellows that belong to it who are employed by CU Boulder and employed by NREL. RACI is an internationally known and respected site of research and renewable energy science. It is active in doing technology research. It does work in economics, studies social issues, and is done quite a bit in education, pulling together energy topics they have both an undergraduate and a graduate energy certificate that you can earn there, which is very good because, as I've found here as well as in my own experience, there isn't really a focal point for energy, which is kind of odd considering how important it is to all of us. The Academy struggles, I think, with putting that together. For the study I did, I primarily used a thematic reading of selected text produced by RACI and by NREL, and then a broad survey of selected literature in renewable energy and communication studies. But I think maybe as important, the work was informed by my experience, and I used sort of what you would call autoethnographic work over my 20 years. Fortunately, for 10 of those years, I was also working on a PhD here, so I used a lot of my work as kind of topic material for my various research projects. So I've kind of documented a bit of what I did at NREL and how communication works there. And I worked in between the engineers and the scientists and either the public or the industry, some other audience in preparing materials. So I'm pretty familiar with that kind of environment. Through my work on this study, I identified several primary narratives that kind of run through the history of energy and renewable energy, and then in turn morph that into what I think of as points of intersection or connection, where communication studies can most benefit working with the field of renewable energy. And when I speak of renewable energy, we like to talk about renewable energy and traditional energy. Really, you can't talk about them separately. It's all the big package of energy, because what happens in traditional energy affects renewables and vice versa. But I will kind of use those interchangeably as I go along today. Today I want to focus more on how some selected traditions of communication studies can interact, I believe, best with a renewable energy setting, and how communication theory and praxis can be used to benefit both fields. And then I'll close with 3 recommendations for projects that I believe communication scholarship could embark upon pretty much right away. Because you're here today, I'm going to assume you might know a little bit about the various forms of renewables. And I'm not going to get too deep into all of that, but let me just cover it briefly, that renewable energy, as you might expect, is a pretty complex topic. It crosses many fields and disciplines. In fact, it's hallmark is almost its interdisciplinarity, which is not easy to say. It covers everything. When I was at NREL, we had scientists all the way from physics to biology to genetics, all working on renewable fuels and renewable technologies. And I believe RACI is a similar kind of situation with a broad range of science, plus economics, plus social studies. So that's one of the keys to the field of energy, and probably why it's so hard to pull it all together in one place. Renewable energy sources were the first energy sources tapped by humans, really, in the form of moving water and direct sunlight, and certainly the combustion of biomass, or the burning of wood, as we call it. But as we know, non-renewable resources have now come to dominate what seems to be our inexhaustible demand for energy. The non-renewable energy sources of oil and coal and natural gas, which are called fossil fuels, are by far the dominant sources of energy currently used. Right now, those comprise about 82% of the total energy that's consumed by the U.S., and then you add another 9-10% that's used by nuclear power, which is also not a renewable resource, but it's not a fossil fuel either. It has its own problems, we know. By contrast, all of the renewable sources combined, which includes hydropower, biomass, wind, geothermal, and solar, are used to a much less extent. They make up about 9% of the total U.S. consumption. And with the removal of hydropower, which is primarily in the Northwest, you end up with wind and geothermal solar, and that makes up about 6% of our national consumption of energy. And although it's a small segment, the last decade has seen pretty strong growth in the use of renewables. And so I think the world might have a little glimmer of hope for the future. The installed global renewable electricity capacity doubled between 2000 and 2012, which is good. In more recent advances, installed wind capacity in the U.S. increased by 28%, and installed solar capacity increased more than 83% from 2011 to 2012. And notably for the future, renewable electricity accounted for more than 56% of all new electrical capacity installations in the U.S. That's a pretty significant increase from back in 2004, when new installations were comprised of only 2% of renewables. So we're making progress. But still, the use of renewables on a broader level are still constrained by cost and efficiency concerns, a wider range of complexities that researchers at RACI and at NREL and elsewhere are addressing. Now let me talk a little bit about the culture of renewable energy settings. And I would say if communication scholars are going to make a significant and lasting contribution to the field of renewable energy, I would argue that they first must fully recognize and understand that the arena of renewable energy and the settings in which it is constructed represent a high-technology organizational culture. And I contend further that the disparity between the communication paradigms of such a high-technology culture and those of the communication scholar are so great as to hinder research collaborations and to constrain the sharing of findings and limit constructive dialogue. Conversely, recognition of these differences on the part of communication researchers and on the part of renewable energy scientists and engineers, I think will greatly aid in the effective integration of the two fields and benefit both. As research settings for renewable energy, both NREL and RACI exhibit characteristics similar to the many definitions of the high technology corporation as identified by Kunda and others. The organization's staffs and affiliates are comprised primarily of scientists and engineers, and both are involved in research and development activities in renewable energy. If you look at the list of fellows on the RACI website, you end up with about 96-98%, I believe, are scientists and engineers, almost evenly split. The rest are economists and lawyers. The subcultures of engineers and scientists bring with them received views on the world that also translate to received views on the value and purpose of communication. Both professions, speaking of scientists and engineers, and speaking generally, and I apologize because it is a generalization and there are people within those fields who are very aware of what communication is about. But even the folks that are most interested in communicating to the public about renewable energy, they have a very rudimentary understanding of what communication is and what communication can do. The professions are steeped in the positivist perspective that they are exploring and seeking to understand an objective reality that exists outside the observer. Several studies argue that the engineering subculture brings with it attitudes and practices that limit or eliminate the effectiveness of communication within a high technology organization. Scientists and engineers, understandably, are trained to do their work, and they are trained as they learn that the communication of these results, or any communication within the research and development process, should be as objective as possible. And the researcher, as she becomes a narrator in publications and journals, must be invisible. The facts carry the argument and should in no way be distorted by language or rhetoric. And often the researcher prefers actually mathematics as the purest language for communicating. It's completely clear of subjective content. These perspectives really lead toward what the communications folks are probably aware of, called the conduit metaphor of communication, described by Coldhaber and others. And it has a linear view of message, which contains all of the information, and that message is simply transmitted from a sender to a receiver. It's the prevailing paradigm of a high technology culture, along with the deficit model of communication, where the need is only to reduce the deficit of knowledge on the part of the audience or the receiver. And to do that, all you have to do is center on the difficulty of bringing useful and accurate information. So you focus on that information being accurate, well constructed, and then once you move it to the receiver, you're pretty well done. Research conducted from these metaphorical constructs, however, tends to concentrate on how this process can be better managed. They worry about managing that linear process, usually within an organizational framework, primarily in order to improve productivity, performance, and profitability. When communication is seen as simply a message exchange, it really becomes pretty easy for these high technology cultures to view that as pretty much less important than all of the other social ingredients that come into play, which they also tend to think is not too important, such as economic realities and political power and natural resources. But most communication scholars recognize that the conduit metaphor for communication does not do full justice to the complete phenomenon, complex phenomenon, and rich possibilities of communication. Evolving over the last few decades, communication scholars, many, now study the dynamic relationships between communication processes and wider systems of human organizing. Communication scholars often now recognize two key facets of discourse, as Cox notes. First, a pragmatic function in which we educate, alert, mobilize, and persuade others. And second, a constitutive function in which language and other symbols themselves help to shape our perceptions about reality. Of course, many other scholars go beyond Cox's perspective. As Kinafuchi states, working from social constructivism, communication scholarship recognizes the constructive and creative nature of communication. It is through communication that reality is created, negotiated, and transformed. In evaluating a beneficial intersection of communication and renewable energy, I argue that it's important to keep in mind both the pragmatic and the constitutive natures of communication. I think the pragmatic can provide a possible bridge to help the positives professionals move into the more full and complete paradigm of the constructivist. Understandably, for the scientist or engineer, such a constructive theory of communication really challenges all of their training and expectations for research and the acquiring of knowledge that exists singularly from the observer. But for the communication scholar of today, the constitutive nature of communication is a valid concept, and it can be applied to the language and artifacts readily found in energy today. I think Dietz expresses this best when he says that language does not represent things that already exist. In fact, language is part of the production of the thing that we treat as being self-evident and natural within the society. For the communication scholar in this context, I argue that it is imperative to attempt to bridge this immense gap of understanding in order to better apply and explore theoretical approaches to communication in this field. There is tremendous potential, I think, for gain by communication studies and the field of renewable energy if this divergent paradigm structure is recognized and rationalized. Collaborative research projects, open and full reporting, and discussion of research processes and results and the potential application of findings, both existing and new to this field of renewable energy, can greatly benefit and enhance both fields. Just a couple of, when I first went to NREL, I was in the technical communication office. We do everything from helping edit professional papers, journal articles, all the way to producing websites, producing brochures. I worked on videos for the last few years, which was very rewarding. But starting there, the famous story was that a prominent researcher there, his quote was, when asked about communication, we would approach the engineers and the scientists to help them with their communication projects. And he would say that, well, every dollar you spend on communication is a dollar not spent on research. And that was pretty much the theme when I got there. It's pretty much the theme when I left, which was last September. Not to say there aren't pockets of folks that really understand what we're about, but that communication that we exercised was really the practice of communication. It did not get into the theory and the practice of communication. So there was so much left out that we couldn't even address at that time. So let me talk a little bit about where I think we might be able to blend these two divergent worlds together. Because I think that communication studies really has a unique potential to provide a vital connection where the constitutive interplay of the texts and conversations of the broad world of renewable energy, where it can be critically studied and understood. Communicative discourses and dynamics exist in the field, of course, but they're not a concentrated focus of scholarly endeavors within communication studies. There really isn't an energy communication field out there. Despite how important, as I said, it is to our world. There are many paths, I believe, to engaging communication scholarship with the world of energy and renewable energy, but I argue for an approach that locates these points of connections where contributions might be the most productive and might be best received by both parties. Communicative work in these areas holds the potential for engaging in and effectively changing elements of the renewable energy field, and it can do it through the application of several communication study traditions and concepts. One of these, I believe, is the area of knowledge creation. Knowledge creation is the heart of the work, really, that you find in the research settings of RACI and NREL, and in most of the departments at CU Boulder. And from the communication studies perspective, knowledge creation, we would say, is very much a communicative process. The social construction theory of science and technology takes a broad view on the influence of scientists, engineers, designers, developers, and users on the choices made in technological development. By learning more about the structure and dynamics of the communicative actions and networks of research scientists, the communication scholar can add to the body of work concerning how knowledge is created in a collaborative effort and how choices are made that lead to the development of some technologies and not others. While there are several theories of knowledge and organizational knowledge in existence, most authors agree that little has really been done in gathering and analyzing empirical evidence for the dynamics of knowledge creation. And I would add that even less has been done in that area in the field of energy. The challenge of the study of knowledge creation as posed by Hicks is that no one individual really possesses all of the knowledge necessary for creating new knowledge. The existing body of knowledge from which new knowledge is formed does not occur, as Hicks states, in a concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge which all the separate individuals possess. He goes on to identify as the essential part of humankind's condition, there is the unavoidable imperfection of man's knowledge and the consequent need for a process by which knowledge is constantly communicated and acquired. I suggest that the research settings of renewable energy present a largely untapped source for studying how this dispersed knowledge is brought together by individuals and groups in an organization and are integrated and made available for the creation of new knowledge. Here we could investigate interactions in practice to identify how communication theory and processes might construct knowledge, sharing, and creation in scientific and technological research and development projects. One of the studies I did for my PhD work at NREL, I joined a engineering team. I was allowed the permission to kind of integrate with an engineering team and took it as a participant observer. I was going to help them with some of their communication needs, and then I was just going to sit in and learn a little bit about what they worked on. And I had no real idea what I was going to find, really. But in sitting through their various team meetings, I was at one where the leader of the team used a simple idea of sketching a battery. This was an advanced battery that a corporation was working on and that NREL was going to do a little research on. So they had the team there, and the team leader started to sketch this battery on the whiteboard. And one of the members of the team had brought back some information from this corporation. The others were definitely experts on batteries, but not on that particular model. So I watched as within about an hour they jointly sketched this battery out, and it was a way of this one individual to impart his information. The others had a very comfortable way to share ideas and brainstorm a bit, as well as to pick up information and to add information. And it was all around this sketch of this battery that they kept working on. I found that fascinating. I since, as part of that, learned that engineers, you may not know it, are very visual learners. And that definitely illustrated itself there. That was just one instance, one little small instance in a very big enterprise that's NREL. There's a lot of those out there, and there's nobody looking at them. And I think that that's kind of a waste. The other area, knowledge creation is one. Another area that I think can stand as a place where we could make some contributions is in the area of demarcation and boundary studies. Because at the core of renewable energy is science, along with its application as technologies. And science and renewable energy, as it does throughout our society, carries its privileges of a primary arbiter of what is real in our Western culture. Scientific knowledge forms the cultural basis for just about all of our beliefs and choices and decisions. Scientific knowledge is in a profoundly privileged position when societies and individuals are making economic, policy, and even ethical decisions. But it is not always clear, especially within a policy-making environment, and energy and renewable energy lives in a very policy-heavy environment. But it's not always clear in that environment what really constitutes science and what does not, or what is considered as valid science or what is not. Loudon argues that much of our intellectual life and increasingly large portions of our social life rest on the assumption that we can tell the difference between science and its counterfeit. And we don't need to look any further than the hotly debated issue of climate change to see how the claim of science can be and has been used and misused to influence policy choices and decisions that are critical to the planet's survival. It's important to explore within a cultural and scholarly context not only how we distinguish between knowledge that is considered scientific and that is not, but how that knowledge is argued and translated across fields and how it is co-constructed and transformed in the process. Scholars suggest that a rhetorical perspective can provide a promising approach to further understanding the question of science boundaries. They argue that science and scientific knowledge are socially constructed through rhetorical practices, and that a science-non-science boundary is also rhetorically constructed. Policy decisions at local and national levels are made based on the political understanding of the distinction between science and non-science, and within the critical realm of energy, these decisions determine funding support of research programs. They set policies that encourage the consumption of some energy sources and not others, and privilege some environmental concerns while denying others. The research settings of RACI and its partners of NREL and at CU Boulder represent tempting loci for the exposition of how scientists themselves set these boundaries, as well as the boundaries between the world of science and the world of policy. Again, I was fortunate enough to do a little study in this area. I looked at several letters written from leading climate scientists to U.S. Senator Barton. I think he was from Texas or Florida, somewhere down there. He was part of a congressional inquiry into climate change. And in this context, the scientists crafted, in their letters, they crafted a very fine rhetorical boundary between science and non-science. And their definitions both confirmed and elaborated what we traditionally think of as science and non-science. And it was a very rare occurrence because scientists are usually too busy doing science to worry about what it is. They rarely sit down and tell you it is this or it isn't. They just kind of know. So it was great to look through those letters and to learn what they in fact believed was science that they were practicing versus the non-science that those who oppose climate change, the concept of climate change, use. That's another example of one little small piece of this big world of energy that is out there available for further research. The third area I think we could make an impact on is that of applying critical theory, and applying critical theory within organizational communication context. While many concepts in the field of organizational communication do apply to the world of energy, because it is a world driven largely by direction and intent of large and small research organizations and private corporations and governmental funding and policy making, I think the critical perspective within organizational communication can be most productive as an entry point into the field. As Craig and Mueller state, and here they define, the critical tradition conceptualizes communication as discursive reflection. That is, discourse that freely reflects on assumptions that may be distorted by unexamined habits, ideological beliefs, and relations of power. According to Dietz, in his application of critical theory to corporations, all communication is distorted to some degree, but organizations and other institutions of privilege are the source of systematic distortion, where there is a latent strategic reproduction of meaning rather than participatory production of it. Examining systematic distortion that constructs meaning, privileging certain positions over others, is a potentially fruitful entry point for communication studies intersection with renewable energy. There are many elements of differential power issues in the field of energy. Multinational corporations, which are some of the largest corporate structures in the world, exert influence over energy decisions all the way from the consumer level up to the governmental level. And then those governments who are susceptible to influence invest billions of dollars in research or incentives to move forward selected techniques. And then as these large research institutions convert those dollars and those directors into technologies that will, for good or ill, impact the lives of each individual on the planet. There are substantial power differentials there, and I've seen them in action at NREL. Our funding comes from the Department of Energy, and the Department of Energy is a political animal and very susceptible to political whims and influences. And I've seen funding cut completely on a project because of purely politics. Well, we are being recorded, aren't we? So maybe I better be careful. But I've seen it, so it does happen. I think this is a situation that merits, indeed, possibly demands close examination by the scholars of communication. A critical perspective can address the structural inequalities that underlie any discourse about energy. As Martin says, the critical study challenges the legitimacy of authority, asks whether shared values are in fact shared, and asks why some people adopt values that seem not to serve their interests. Critical theory can also look at the, which I think is a fascinating area, the legitimizing by communicative means, the legitimizing of some participants in these various energy discussions as experts, and the eliminating of some. Generally, the general public are not listened to in these kinds of debates. So I think renewable energy technologies, they can be seen really as reflective of the organizational cultures that move them, and they speak to the structural distortions of communicative processes in action in the system. Critical studies applied to these processes can really help us understand motivations and movements within these broad interdisciplinary systems. Time for a drink. So let's kind of wrap it up. RACI and its partners, particularly NREL, I think, are rich and productive research sites for investigating communication within the multidisciplinary field of renewable energy. In these settings, work is being done to advance leading-edge science and technology in all aspects of renewable energy, and in the economic, legal, business, and political components that factor into the development and implementation of the technologies. Such opportunities are rare for communication scholars to enter into these sites for the purposes of introducing and researching communicative theories and praxis. Communication scholars should view the RACI partnership as the embodiment of this opportunity and use it as a setting for research, particularly collaborative research, and as a setting for co-constructing knowledge through presentations and publications within RACI. To achieve this, I suggest it is best for the communication scholar, just to reflect on what I've talked about here, I think it's best to interact with the renewable energy field through points of connection, where communication studies have the most effect and may be most easily accepted. I think communication scholarship can involve itself in exploring scientific and technical knowledge creation within the research setting, using theories of constitutive communication. I think you can probe boundaries between scientific, technical, and non-technical fields to seek definitional understanding of science and non-science and how arguments translate across fields. And I think you can employ critical theory in studying the interplay of power and participation within renewable energy, and particularly in areas of behavioral change and policy setting. I also argue that it's imperative for renewable energy that such contributions be made. The progress of renewable energy has been driven by crisis narratives, and it's been subjected to political whims, resulting in inconsistent and intermittent support and constraining the technologies from reaching their substantial potential. As I mentioned, funding being cut for political motives. I was recently doing a video on a solar technology that everyone might not have heard of. It's called concentrating solar power. It's CSP for short. Instead of actually converting solar energy into electricity, it uses the heat from the sun. And you may have seen some of these. Primarily they use curved mirrors. So they have a long trough of a curved mirror. Running down the center of it is a tube that contains a fluid that will retain heat, usually some kind of an oil. And the heat from the sun will heat that oil to a very, very high temperature. It can then be used to run a traditional steam power plant. It'll boil the water, create the steam, and generate electricity. Another use of it is, you may have seen some of this, and I recommend going to look at this. It's fantastic. It's called a power tower. It's out, they've just built a new one west of Las Vegas, out in the desert. And they built a great big tower, and then they put around it mirrors. The one I looked at in Arizona had 12,000 mirrors. The one in outside Las Vegas, I think, is even bigger. I don't know how many mirrors it has, but the tower's larger, and so the mirrors focus toward the top of the tower. In the tower is another a material that will retain the heat. In that case, they use molten salt. And as you drive by the one out in Nevada, you can see this top of this tower just glowing bright white. And then they use the molten salt. Again, they pump it down, and it runs a steam generator. The great thing about it is it's not susceptible to weather or lack of sunlight, because you can store this material, either the oil or the molten salt or other material that retains the heat can be stored and generate electricity all through the night. So that's a great advantage of it. Well, when I was interviewing these people talking about the technology, we did a video of it, and actually the video is online at the Department of Energy. They kept referring back to 10 years ago. We were doing this and this, and now we're doing this and this. And I said, well, what happened in between? Well, nothing happened in between. Somewhere in the late 90s, can't understand what happened, but something happened there, and they basically cut all funding to this technology for 10 years. And it had just been started up again in 2011, I think, something like that. 10 years where all they did was keep the lights on, basically, and they started up again. And they've done great things in the last couple of years, just from starting up again. But for primarily political reasons, they lost a lot of time. And that happens quite a bit in the field of renewable energy. And basically, I think communication can help with that. Somebody playing a song out there? I think communication scholarship working in the area of renewable energy can go a long way to understanding why those things happen and to possibly help overcome some of them. And as specific next steps in engaging communication scholarship, specifically looking at the RACI context and the department here, I think there are three research opportunities that I think you could focus pretty directly on. The first one is the creation and establishment of an energy communication course, a basic energy communication course that could be part of RACI's educational offerings. RACI justifiably places substantial weight on its ability to offer undergraduate, as I talked about, and graduate energy certificates, and they do a great job on their website of listing all of the energy-related courses at CU, Boulder, which is great to find that in one place. I think the pragmatic, skill-oriented function of communication is represented in their offerings. Actually, they have courses in science writing and journalism listed as electives for their energy certificate. And while those are valuable in their own right, certainly, obviously those course topics don't touch on the complex, constructive nature of communication and how it is at play throughout the world of renewable energy. A course offered at the graduate level that introduces non-communication students to the rich world of communication theory and praxis, I think would be a notable step moving forward in getting communication onto an equal footing with the other disciplines at RACI, as well as introducing RACI's staff and fellows and affiliates to the value of communication scholarship. I think that would be kind of a first step. A second one would be to look at to do a thematic content analysis of some of the selected big energy talks. The big energy talks are one of the primary public offerings of RACI, and they're all listed online back for several years. A lot of them have videos, and they cover very significant topics. They have some people that are highly regarded in many fields, economics as well as the technical and scientific fields. So there is that data available. And I think by looking through that, you could identify major discourses and narratives. You could look for concepts that could be revealed that would guide additional research. And I think a presentation to the members of RACI on the results could initiate discussion on the role of communication scholarship in renewable energy. I think that would be a great project. And the third one involves a little more interaction with the RACI folks, and that is that I noticed if you look over the listing of all of the big energy topics over the past few years, a pretty large number deal with economic modeling and forecasting energy prices and costs, that sort of thing. They're frequent project topics, and they formulate future scenarios for various markets, and they look at various technologies and what they might do under certain assumptions. And they do that in order to identify barriers to adoption and also to rationalize choices in making investments in technology advancement or in recommending specific policies. I think it would be of great interest to follow the formulation of one such model from both a rhetorical and a critical perspective. I think you could ask some very interesting research questions, such as what are the fundamental questions that guide these models, and how are they constructed communicatively? Which voices are included and which voices are excluded from the process, and what are the received privileges that are inherent in those decisions, and who are the experts and how are they rhetorically constructed? You don't see those inner workings ever exposed when they are discussing these economic models. As mentioned, there's no energy communication field at present, and there are only early attempts at establishing really an energy discipline within the academy. But I think with this opportunity that the department might have to work more closely with the RACI, there can be the beginnings of such a field within communication studies. Scholars can begin to study artifacts, text, and performances of energy and renewable energy. Energy discourse is a body of work, indeed a body of constructed knowledge, and ultimately communication studies can make contributions that benefit its own scholarship, the other disciplines within energy, and even help the planet. I look at the field of subfield, whatever you want to call it, of environmental communication as a fairly recent development that's really grown into a very robust field of study. I don't know why energy communication shouldn't be in the same category. Such an attempt is collaborative exploration into the richer meanings of communication within the renewable energy setting has the potential for really constructing a paradigmatic shift in both fields and potentially across all of the disciplines encompassed by energy and renewable energy. Meyerson and Ryden argue that a dialogue of engagement is needed as a source of knowledge and validity claims. Finally, Throgmorton asks that those at work in a field of knowledge, such as energy and renewable energy, should work not to speak purely scientifically or purely politically, but to find a rhetoric that helps to create and sustain a public democratic discourse, a discourse that allows all of us to talk coherently about contestable views of what is good, what is right, and what's feasible. He goes on to suggest that we create arenas that facilitate and encourage just such a persuasive public discourse. I would argue that RACI is just such an arena, and one that can be immeasurably more effective if it's in partnership with communication scholars who understand at its core the co-creation, the value, and the meaning of such a rich discourse. And that's all I have to say. Yes?
So, do you think that study of RACI, or renewable and sustainable energy, is different than other big science initiatives?
Yes, I do. I think it is probably because, from my perspective, I see it as being more inherently consisting of more multi-disciplines than others, in that even though the scientists and the scientist team are working pretty well focused, there really isn't a science. Even this battery team I was working with, none of them work without a pretty strong awareness of policy and policy decisions and funding decisions. Just because I think renewable energy has been for so long, it inspires a commitment, but it also inspires antagonism. It's not a pure scientific endeavor, like maybe developing a new material for constructions or something like that. It's really just totally involved in policy and economics and politics all the time. And so I think even though the bulk of RACI's fellows are scientists and engineers, and there aren't that many in the social studies world involved, I would say they're still all very aware of all of those disciplines. And that's, I think, why they do so much. Even NREL has started the last few years to do a lot of economic analysis. They're doing a lot of projections that they didn't used to do. So they're taking their technologies and building these complex models to say, here's what happened if wind does this and this and this. Here's what it's going to look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And I don't think you'd find a lot of even the big energy, big science. I mean, you're not going to find that level, I think, of involvement. But that's just what I've observed. So for that reason, I think it's, in many ways, even more fascinating than big science, because it's got so much more going on, and because it is a very passionate topic. You can hardly talk to anybody who isn't passionate one way or the other. Yeah.
I'm curious, particularly in your experiences at NREL, about examples you have of some of these particular communication ideas really making a difference. So I'm imagining maybe a skeptical audience listening to this presentation and saying, okay, this is great. You're adding some insight to how we might think about this. You're giving us a new vocabulary to describe some of the complexities that we're involved in. But at the end of the day, when did a communication perspective change the technology that we developed, enhance the policy, actually got the funding? Isn't it really the science is driving this? And if you want to package it a little nicer or call it a constitutive thing or whatever you communication people want to do, can you speak to that kind of skepticism?
Sure.
That this is not just a different way of talking about this or an enhanced way of understanding, but it can really make a difference in the way decisions are made, batteries are developed, whatever.
Yeah, unfortunately, because there hasn't been very much work done in introducing theory into that world at all of communication. In fact, I'm the only, until I retired in September, I'm the only communication person in the National Laboratory System, because one left, that has a PhD in communication. I don't know that, I doubt that many of them have a PhD in most anything, but they view, that world views communication very much as a practice. And it's a practice to be generally avoided if possible. But we have to do it, so we'll do it. So it's very difficult to say, here's a place where it has worked like that. But I have seen communication, even from a practice point of view, definitely work like that. And I'll cite two instances. Well, one's a little more generic, but I used to do a lot of web development work. And if a program wanted a website, now I don't know if you've been on the Department of Energy website or the NREL website, they're very strong in that area. They have a very robust, very large, thousands of pages on the Department of Energy's website. We do all that at NREL. So we have a web team that does the technical part, and then always a communicator takes the lead on producing a website, and we'll work with the program manager and the people in the program to develop what that website looks like, all the way from architecture to how you move through it, to the look and feel of it. Somewhat constrained by having to fit into certain guidelines, but still a lot of flexibility into how it looks and how you navigate it, the whole thing. I have seen more than once I would come in. The buildings program is one that I thought of, the energy efficient buildings program we had. They didn't know it, but they used the development of the website as a way to organize. They were in one place. They worked on all these different projects. They weren't sure who should report to who, where this little piece should go, where this little piece should go. Through the construction of the website, we would work with them, and we literally watched them organize their program based on that website. It was just a great tool for doing that. They would never admit that, but I saw where they were before and I saw where they were after, and I sat through every meeting as we pulled them along over 9 months or a year of developing that site. I've seen that happen more than once. So it's a case of where communication really interacts to do that. And what's missing is nobody's there to study that. And what a dynamic that is, what a great dynamic that is. And there's nobody there to study that. I did a little bit. I got the pleasure of, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Solar Decathlon. It's a really great project, super project that the DOE does. It's a college competition, and we get 20 teams of colleges, and they work to build a solar-powered house. And their goal is to build a solar-powered house that is net zero, as they say, that it produces as much energy as it uses, and one that is possibly reproducible, one that is marketable. And they used to be, they would culminate in a big show. They would all come to the mall in Washington, D.C. and build these solar houses and then have them open for viewing and competition. And we would measure them for 10 days, and they'd compete in. It's called a decathlon because there were 10 different things they would compete in. And so I involved myself through that a little bit, and how they built their websites, and how building their websites impacted their projects. And so I did a little bit of study about that, but generally nobody's in there looking at that kind of a thing, and it's huge. I know people do look at design of websites, they do look at usability studies, but they don't look at it as an organizational tool, and I've seen it do that.
Are people you work with, are they receptive to that kind of research of
No.
not just, I want to look at the documents, but like you talked about, just kind of spending time with the battery project.
Right.
I mean, what's been...
You'll find some that are. The gentleman who ran the battery team was super. He was very welcoming, very interested in what I was doing, and really thought it was cool. And so he was very open to me coming in and just sitting there and listening to them, taking notes. He really enjoyed it. And I think the battery team did too after a while. A little bit they're looking at me, who is this and what's going on? But, after a while you kind of blend in. And I was helping them with some of their communication things. So you'll find people who are. You'll find some people who are very, very aware of the need to communicate scientific ideas to the public and to, but they're very few and they're very far between. And none of them, like I said, have any, they only scratch the surface of what communication. Oh, the other example I wanted to make was there's an award, it's kind of the Oscar of scientists, called the R&D 100s. You guys may have heard of that, but R&D magazine is a well-known magazine, and they give out 100 awards every year. Big deal. It really, gets a lot of press, a lot of attention. The scientists love to get those awards, and the lab loves to brag about it. For years, we were getting maybe one award a year at the most. It just wasn't going well. So they finally got a communication person involved. We went from about one a year to 4, 5 a year, every year thereafter. You could look at the record of before and after a communication person was involved in writing these pieces. But it isn't just writing, it's going there and understanding the technology and understanding the research project and pulling out of those folks what's important, what they've done, what's the key highlights, They don't think about those things. And that was a big success. Again, getting them to admit that. I never got anybody to admit that it was the involvement of the communication office that made that turnaround, even though you can point to it. They believed it was, we're doing a better job at organizing or something. But, and I was going to say, when I got my PhD, it got kind of well known around that I got it, and one of the main effects of it was that some engineers commented that they didn't know you could get a PhD in communication, which is, why would you? So, unfortunately, that's kind of the environment. But like I say, I don't want to completely, a lot of folks there really got the value that we added. But we rarely got to do anything on the level of what communication scholarship can really do. Anyone else?
David, I'm interested in the case that you described about dormancy. And you described the situation in which project teams or established research programs have to go dormant.
Yes.
Partly as a result of cut funding.
Yes.
Is that a frequent occurrence?
Yes.
I'm wondering if there's an inherent communication opportunity there, in the sense that we often make claims, like, for example, communication constitutes organization. That also implies communication can constitute disorganization as well. I'm interested in how it is that researchers, as you would say, dial down or dial back or destructure so that they're just leaving the lights on. Mm-hmm. Or the other analogy might be mothballs. Mm-hmm. Another analogy might be induced coma. Mm-hmm. Is there any established research that deals with that question of minimal sufficiency?
You mean that process itself of dialing back? Not that I know of.
Or, how do we know when and where that threshold is of maintaining viability. Just curious about it.
Most of the ones I've tended to see are almost like flipping a switch. I was very involved in geothermal energy, and geothermal energy regularly got about $20 million a year for research. And there was one politician who, because of where he was from, really touted geothermal technology. It was one of his favorite topics. So he ensured, and he was fairly highly placed in Congress and helped a lot in getting that funding consistent. One year, for various political reasons, he fell out of favor and out of power. And the next year, it went from $20 million to maybe $2 million. And they had a staff of people working. They just basically, they laid a few people off, and then they shifted others to other departments, to other areas, and really left maybe one person part-time, keeping projects going. The thing about NREL is that you have to know is that most of their work is outsourced. I mean, they partner every project. So if they have a power project, a geothermal research project to drill a deep hole or something like that, they partner with corporations to do it. And corporations usually share at least half the cost, sometimes more. So every single project NREL is involved in has a corporate partner, one or more. So when the funding is reduced, usually the corporate partner would finish whatever's being worked on, and they would just not do any further work on it. So NREL isn't big, it isn't like they have 50 people working on this project. It's that they use corporate resources a lot for the manpower, people power. So it isn't like laying off 50 or 100 people when you lose that kind of funding. But you would lay off some people and then just go dormant until the funding returned. In geothermal's case, it wasn't down too long, about 4 years, I think, that it was basically $0 million or less. And then it came back big time, and they took off again. But nobody I know has studied that process or how it works. It would be an interesting organizational situation. And I don't know how it affects other, I know it affected NREL because of our funding is, from government. I don't know how it would affect a private research firm. I suspect it might be similar. Yes?
Other than research and topics that you talked about, now that given your experience in NREL and now your PhD in communication, if you were running NREL or an organization like it, what would it look like different today?
Oh. Yeah, that's a hard one. It's a very complicated environment. They deal with a lot. They get all their funding from the Department of Energy, and that's all appropriated through Congress. And it's definitely a challenge to balance all of that. And I think they've done a fantastic job. And the current director has done a great job. He's done a wonderful job in getting funding to build new facilities, and they built just some great facilities in the last 10 years on what we call the permanent site. It's on South Table Mesa on the side there. Moved everybody out of leased office space into the one campus, and how he did all that is beyond me. He just did an amazing job at being able to raise the capital expenditures. We've also doubled the size, I believe, of researchers active there. And we have great, great minds working on it. So I think they've really done a great job. I don't know that there's much else I could have them do. So much of it's out of their control. It's all, it's what happens in Congress and what happens.
I was more thinking of how would you use communicators differently?
I would definitely, my dream, which didn't come to pass, but my dream was always to get my PhD and then to go out and secure research funding for it. I think that's probably the biggest change that I would do. I think there's opportunities to do that, not very many, but there are opportunities to do that. And that was my dream, was to go to the Department of Energy the Department of Energy has a big office that does the energy efficiency and renewable energy research. It also has the Office of Science, which it gets even more money for just general science work. So in that whole area, I know you could find somebody with $100,000 who wanted to invest in a communication research project. That would be so super to be able to bring in money, because that's the name of the game at NREL, is how much money can you bring in, to bring in money for a strictly communication research project, to do some of these things we were talking about. And I just never got the opportunity. I was off onto other things, and by the time I got my PhD, it was pretty late in my career, and so I tried a few things, but nothing really took. It would probably take a good 3 years of concentrated effort. And unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of support from my peers in the communication field to do that, and you do need some backup. But that would be super, and I think there's money to do that somewhere. That's why I think with RACI there might even be some potential there, depending on where their funding's coming from. But to define a well-crafted research study that's going to lead to a specific benefit would be great. Mm-hmm.
I heard you suggesting I heard you stating, I think, that the folks at NREL are really good at their job, right? It's not as if there's any kind of concerns about their scientific expertise, and that maybe efficiency is the wrong word. Maybe knowledge production could actually be enhanced through the incorporation of communication folks. The example you just set up seemed to situate a communication project outside of. I'm wondering how you might think about communication scholars, members of battery production teams who maybe know a little bit about battery production, but not really because they're communication folks, right? Mm-hmm. But are able to participate in the actual knowledge production that leads to a battery, as opposed to say, reflecting on the practice. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense.
Oh, you mean to be more integrated as part of the team?
Right.
Yeah, I think that would have, I haven't really thought too much about that. I'm not real sure what that would look like, but I could see that. They do have communication people as part of the team from the point of view of communication practice. We on a big project, you would have a communication person probably, in some cases, assigned to that team to help them more with, outward communication or editing technical papers. It's a very practice-oriented kind of expertise that they look for. But being involved in, I think, for example, the leader of that battery team was so interested in what I was doing that probably I think I probably helped him a little bit in communicating with his team and feeding back to him what he was doing that was effective. So I think a role like that would certainly be beneficial. Yeah. But I haven't really thought too much about what that would look like. But
just a comment. I mean, it strikes me that an obvious interest in communication issue in someplace like RACI is looking at meetings where you have experts from different disciplines. There are, sure, I can't imagine there isn't coordination trouble, jockeying of whose way of framing things should take precedence. Now this is short, so looking at how people are talking to each other and where the places of misunderstanding and conflict are. And I mean, that's centrally a kind of communication, meetings in organizations. Any big project has to manage and deal with that. Now so that's why my initial question, I'm not so sure that what's interesting communicatively would be that different, although I thought you had a nice answer that there's a heavier policy rather than science, and so that would introduce different concerns into meetings than ones where science engineering was sort of the central issue, because it really is taken seriously. It's not just what we're doing, but how we're presenting it to others who make decisions about it.
Yeah, and just my tendency with my background, I tend not to go to group interaction and social interaction kinds of things, but that would have a commonality certainly between big science and this.
So Karen, it sounds like in addition to discourse communities and framing there, another optional concept might be argument spheres.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought early on in the talk, I flashed Leah's job talk, I think, and expertise and how expertise is invoked and whose expertise matters, right?
I couldn't help but, in all your talk, you brought up political issues all the time, but you never suggested that communication scholars have a particular insight to politics, and both in terms of communicating with publics, but also kind of the political communication dynamics of alternative energy. And I was curious about that disconnect and hypothesizing in my head why that might be, whether it's that NREL knows this is all political but doesn't want to go there, and so in your giving us recommendations, you wouldn't suggest we go there either. Or that you tend to be more of an org-com person, so think of things in terms of those connections. But I would just be curious, rather than me making up answers in my head.
You just answered correctly.
Oh, okay. Anything else to add to that?
On all points. I started in org-com. I moved into rhetoric, so org-com to rhetoric. So that's my background, and so yes, I tend not to. We all tend to think from our background. So that's kind of what I do. But specifically to NREL, it's very important to note is that NREL is absolutely, expressly, in writing, prohibited from doing anything political. They cannot do anything that even tends to look like lobbying of any kind, or asking for money, or going back there to market their services. They absolutely can't do any of that. So they do stay completely away from it. Now, that's not realistic, of course, because that is their life, but they are not allowed to do it. So they basically, we put everything in the framework of education, really, and that's what we do. We educate. If we're educating, we have staff members come out. We have one time a year when all of the staff from Congress comes out and tours NREL to learn what we're doing, not to be told that we need more money for this or that, just to learn what we're doing, because that's...
Education is persuasion.
Absolutely. Education can be persuasion.
And
Yes.
almost always is.
Leah, that intervention is helpful for me because it reminds me that there's an ecology of topics and issues here, which we can only gain partial perspective on through the NREL RACI vantage. And so thinking about deliberation and thinking about the integrity of public involvement, of public participation in energy policy development, RACI, NREL will never advance, or will never prioritize. But NSF, on the other hand, so it's possible that RACI networks and NREL networks might be able to facilitate a communication scholar moving to that point, but not as a direct collaborator is what it sounds like. Does that sound accurate to you?
Mm-hmm. That's about it. Well, thank you all. Thanks for sticking through it. Appreciate it.